Hello, everyone. This is Joe Tucker, president of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers. We started off season two of the Rule of Law. The Academy speaks with a boom, and we're ending it with a boom. I am happy and delighted to let you guys know that Kate Shaw is here to talk to us. Kate Shaw has her own podcast called Strict Scrutiny with Leah Littman and Melissa Murray. If you are a lawyer in America, or if you're someone who's interested in what's going on in the law in America, I strongly suggest, urge, demand, I'm issuing an order that you subscribe to Strict Scrutiny so you can hear in detail what is going on in the law. First off, Kate, thank you and welcome to my podcast, The Rule of Law, the Academy Speaks.
Joe, thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to close out your season.
Yeah, I'm going to jump into it because so many things are happening. People who know your background. You're a professor of law at Penn, you clerk in the Supreme Court for Justice Paul Stevens. But I want to talk about what's going on over what seems like 4 years, but it's literally only been 10 months. What is going on with the rule of law, and is it under attack?
In a word, yes, it is under attack. I agree. I share the sentiment that it feels as though we have been in the era of the second Trump administration for much longer than under a year, which is how long it has been. But I do think that we have seen from the executive branch a sustained attack on core rule of law norms, free expression, the right to counsel, the right to due process, whether we're talking about targeted killings or immigration detention proceedings. We have seen violations of statutes and the Constitution, statutes constraining the president's power to fire, statutes providing for funds. We have seen, I think, a pretty broad disregard of, again, law, whether it's statutes or the Constitution, but in some ways more fundamentally, rule of law norms about fairness, fair dealing, government power being wielded for public purposes rather than private gain. So sorry that was a long list, but I think to your
But
question, the answer is clearly yes.
I've used the metaphor that his challenges to constitutional norms and the rule of law is like whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Each day I wake up, and even before I brush my teeth, I just look and see what attack has been made. Are all of these almost daily, if not weekly attacks? Should we be concerned about them, or will we return back to, I guess, a new norm when his administration's over?
I am a fundamentally optimistic person, so I do think that there will be an after time when there will
Mhm.
be an enormous task of rebuilding and reconstruction to do. But I think that tremendous lasting damage has already been done. So just to take one example, the longstanding norms of nonpartisanship in the Justice Department, right? When it comes to the federal law enforcement, I mean both criminal and civil, those are longstanding norms honored with, not perfect compliance, but in the main by presidents, Democratic and Republican alike, for decades. And I just think that kind of post Watergate order is in absolute disarray. And those norms inside the Justice Department have been shredded. And that's, I think, true across government, but it feels especially troubling in the context of the enforcement of the federal criminal law. And so I do think that the task of rebuilding in some future administration is going to be daunting. But again, back to the optimism, I do think it is doable. And I think it will occasion an opportunity to kind of rethink and maybe even to create a new, stronger, more durable norms that will better protect that institution and other government institutions against any future threats.
Well, two things. One, I want to talk about not justice. I want to talk about the Justice Department's attack on what some people consider targeted prosecutions. And I was heartened to see the magistrate judge go after the Justice Department for its indictment of Jim Comey. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you were able to take, if anything,
Yeah.
away from the magistrate judge's discussion with the U.S. attorney yesterday?
Right. So we have, I think probably other examples, but in some ways the most pressing, egregious examples of what are clearly politically motivated prosecutions of individuals whom the president views as enemies are the prosecutions of former FBI Director Jim Comey and New York Attorney General Tish James. And, the charges are different. With James, there's mortgage fraud alleged. With Comey, it's about alleged misstatements in the context of some congressional testimony. Both brought by a handpicked temporary U.S. attorney who agreed to bring these charges before grand juries, according to reporting, at least after career officials and even an earlier Trump-picked head of that office declined to bring charges in both cases on the grounds that there just wasn't evidence. To predicate the charges. And so there were right now, there are motions to dismiss pending in both cases. And so the judge is very interested in getting access to discovery regarding the decision made to charge Comey and also the representations made before the grand jury. So I think the last development is that the Justice Department was ordered to turn over some grand jury materials and seems to have declined to do that in what was not even recognizably a legal motion, not a motion for reconsideration,
Yeah.
not an effort to mandamus, just a no kind of response. And so that seems like it warrants some very serious escalation on the part of the judge to compel compliance with a pretty straightforward order. But it does suggest to me that the case is, there are very serious arguments, both substantive defenses, right? Selective and vindictive prosecution, and also kind of procedural and personnel related questions about the permissibility of, or the, kind of validity of the
Or
appointment of
whether
Lindsay
she,
Halligan. Yeah.
yeah, whether or not she is empowered to, even whether she is sitting as a proper U.S. attorney
Correct.
who's not been approved. But that will all wash out in the wash. But you talk about what's going on now with the political prosecution. What then happens, assuming there is a different administration and Trump doesn't have a third term?
Yeah.
uh, when there's a different administration for some of the acts that are perceived to be constitutional or violations, if the next administration prosecutes some of these people, or do they just wash their
Yeah.
hands and we walk away with these challenges that have happened to the Constitution? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
I think it's such an important question. And an example, an earlier kind of version of this question of what a successor Democratic administration should do about some of the kind of wrongdoing in a predecessor administration was presented in the early years, or the early days really, of the first term of President Obama's administration, when there was a real question whether to pursue any of the individuals who had been the architects of the enhanced interrogation program in the federal government, in conjunction with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and, obviously the wake of September 11th. And essentially the decision was made to sort of move forward, right? That sort of beginning a cycle of retribution and recrimination would do more damage to our constitutional order than would essentially a decision to just move forward. And I think at the time there were people who thought that was misguided or short-sighted. I'm not going to take a position about the kind of correctness and hindsight of that. I do think it was a considered and careful and thoughtful decision. But I think it just kind of calls the question is that, imagine there is a Democratic president inaugurated in 2029 on January 20th. There will be a ton of questions, some of which you alluded to in your last question about kind of rebuilding some of the norms of institutions like the Justice Department. But there's also going to be a very specific question, right, which is, should there be criminal prosecutions that are in some ways responsive to the abuse of the criminal justice process that we are seeing right now? Or will that kind of just further lead to this ever escalating arms race of, criminalization of one's predecessors that will sort of, only kind of further poison our political and constitutional
It makes us a
order?
government. It makes us a government that I thought I would never see in America, where you have
Yeah.
one administration jailing people from the prior administration.
Yeah.
And I can only think, if there is a Democratic administration coming in after Trump is done, he talks about Joe Biden's automatic pen. He's just going to be able to sign and just fill
Yeah.
in names, because I can imagine the hundreds of pardons that
Right.
he'll have to issue
Yeah.
that are going on.
Yeah, so that could take off the table the question of whether any prosecutions of individuals, officials in this administration might be possible if Trump tries to or does actually just issue some broad blanket pardons to any high-ranking individual who he might think could potentially face legal jeopardy in a successor administration, then that sort of, discrete question is off the table. But the kind of larger question of, well, is the new normal that the an administration sort of does this backward look and potentially uses the tools of the Justice Department against their, adversaries and potentially predecessors, or should we kind of collectively decide that that way lies just madness and no future president should engage in it? I think it's a very hard question. I mean, my institutionalist instincts point in the direction of no, that sort of retribution, I think, would only kind of, worsen the problem as opposed to really address and fix it. But I also think
I'm gonna agree to disagree with you on
yeah,
that.
yeah. So and tell me, and of course there's another argument.
Yeah, because I think what it does, it causes people to actually lose faith
Yeah.
also, that when you see crime right in front of you, and when you see what's happening right in front of you, and you have the powerful walking away from this, because I can suggest to you, Justin, we won't get into the No Kings protest. We don't have enough time, but there are those people who see absolute wrong here. And I can imagine there are going to be a significant number of voters who will want to vote because of the crimes that they see.
Mm.
And then when that happens, because I don't think you can compare what happened when Obama was president to what is happening now, what happened with the enhanced interrogation. It's almost from my mind like the Obama years were some fantasy Disney years
Yeah.
compared to what's going on now, and you keep hearing the expression where constitutional norms are no longer normal. And maybe this is I think a returning to normal would be prosecuting or investigating those people who broke constitutional norms. That's my perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there is obviously something to that, if especially if you think even if the comparison has its limitations, but if you think it was a mistake to essentially allow lawlessness to go unpunished from the George W. Bush administration, did that in some ways set us on the path that we are on now? And it's an interesting question. Will voters be moved to actually cast ballots and then expect to see, an actual, so I think there's different ways to frame it. A campaign of retribution like that I would urge against, but actually meaningful justice against those who are responsible for the destruction of constitutional norms and the violation of criminal laws. I think if you kind of cast it in the second light, there's obviously a real argument that that is a much better path to go down.
And I didn't mean retribution, and that's
No,
maybe me feeling the anger that I sometimes feel. But being like you, one person who loves the Constitution, loves his
yeah,
country, I wouldn't want retribution. I would want
right.
justice.
Yeah.
And what justice looks like, I would like for a special prosecutor and a grand jury to determine what it looks like. I'm going to shift gears for just a moment to something that you probably in a minute you probably can't even help answer this in the short time we have here, and that's what's going on with our Supreme Court. I I was I felt good yesterday listening to the argument about the tariffs, and tell me if I'm reading too much into some of the questions I heard in the argument. It's almost as if the Supreme Court was saying you can't overstep Congress's powers, even if Congress, from my view, has abdicated its powers. But by the same token, it seems the Supreme Court has also said, Mr. President, you can run over the court system. So it's protecting Congress's power, while in other opinions, it is seen not to protect judicial power. What's your take on this?
Yeah, that was interesting. I mean, I would push back a tiny bit on on the framework in that I think it's right that the Supreme Court has really thrown lower courts under the bus when it has been confronted with, ruling for the president on the one hand and siding with district courts that have, carefully considered challenges to various executive actions, and then often without any explanation, the court has just put on hold those lower court rulings. So for sure, it has sided with the president over the lower courts. But I think it has always also sided with its own institutional interests as the Supreme Court. So I think it views itself somewhat differently. But I think it's right. You saw in the tariff arguments a sort of a surprising amount of kind of pro Article 1, pro congressional authority sentiment, in particular from the more conservative justices. I mean,
Amy Coney Barrett, for example, I recorded it and had to hit rewind to make sure that was her talking and not Ketanji Brown Jackson.
and Neil Gorsuch as well. So he at one point described what the Solicitor General arguing for the Trump administration was asking for was basically a one-way ratchet toward like continual accretion of executive power and away from the people's elected representatives in Congress. And that was refreshing. I mean, I was, of course, wondering where that energy was in many of the earlier shadow docket
Yes.
opinions, or I hesitate to even call them opinions. Most of the time, they're just orders that are often, again, unreasoned. But many of those presented a variation on this question, which is the president is claiming authority that rightly resides in Congress. So there have been a number of these spending cases that have come up on the shadow docket, and the court has, in almost all of them, ruled for the president, even though what the lower courts in those cases found was that the president was usurping Congress's power of the purse. Well, we had a different congressional power at stake in the tariffs argument, Congress's taxing power, but that's also a very clear congressional power the Constitution gives to Congress.
That's what was shocking to and I'll call myself a casual listener to Supreme Court arguments, as opposed to someone who is knowledgeable of the Supreme Court like you. It seemed to be the same argument that has been made before, but for reasons unbeknownst to the casual listener like me, that they didn't go off the rails. They stayed on the rails with these, what I think are basic constitutional arguments.
Well, I hardly think of you as a casual listener, but it is true. I am professionally obligated to listen to essentially every minute of every Supreme Court argument. And I shared your impression. I found it surprising that they were as clearly troubled as they were by these just, broad sweeping worldwide tariffs that Trump swept into office and began imposing. And they are concerned that there's a problem under the Constitution separation of powers, that they are concerned that the statute upon which the president is relying doesn't actually confer the authority that he is claiming. Now, unfortunately, I think it is sometimes, especially with Justice Barrett, who I think is not always, you can't read too much into her tenor at oral argument because she has seemed in a number of cases to be skeptical during arguments, only to rule with the administration when it comes to the actual opinion. So I don't know where she'll come down. But I do think certainly the three Democratic appointees, the Chief Justice, those four seemed really skeptical of the administration. And at times, both Barrett and Gorsuch did as well. So it is definitely possible to see this administration lose this case that, Trump on the eve of the argument called like one of the most important Supreme Court arguments ever heard. It would be, according to Trump, disaster for the country if the court struck down the tariff. So for Trump, at least, the stakes are really, really high. And, the court so far has not told the president no in any really categorical way. It has ruled partially against him in a handful of shadow docket matters, but the vast majority of the court's rulings since January have been in favor of the administration. So this would be an enormous deal if, in fact, they rule against him here.
Did I understand Gorsuch to ask the question or pose the hypothetical to the Solicitor General? Are you essentially saying the president can go to war without asking for congressional authority? Did I hear that correctly?
You sure did. Or that, so basically he was saying there's some powers that Congress has under the Constitution, and it can't give those away. And it has the power to declare war, right? The president and Congress have shared authority when it comes to war, national defense, national security. But the declaration of war is very clearly conferred on Congress, that power. So it was somewhat surprising that Gorsuch seemed to be suggesting that Congress could just entirely hand that power to the president and the president could unilaterally declare war. So that was a place where I thought that Sauer, who's the Solicitor General, might have actually lost Gorsuch, which would be really significant. Because if there's no limiting principle to the argument about their conception of the, kind of boundaries, if there are any, of presidential power, then there's not much left to the separation of powers. And I'm not sure the majority of the justices want to kind of co-sign the literal end of the separation of powers, which I fear is the logical endpoint of some of the arguments that the administration is making here.
Do you get the sense that sometimes the president wants to be unchecked by both Congress and the court?
Absolutely. I don't think, yeah, I don't think he's willing to recognize legitimate checks on his authority. Now, he has again said he would listen to rulings of the Supreme Court. He said that in several interviews, and his Solicitor General at the argument over the kind of the injunctions in the birthright citizenship case last spring said the same thing. We will listen to a ruling of this court, the Supreme Court. But I think, kind of fundamentally, no, I don't think the president views as legitimate any checks on his authority.
But he's always one to play with words.
Yes.
He says he'll listen. He didn't say I'll abide by or I will follow,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
which is him. He's dumb as a fox, and with his wordplay with that.
Yeah, I think that is going to be it would be a risky move if part of the reason the Supreme Court has been as solicitous of this president as it has been is because it is worried about forfeiting institutional authority if it issues a ruling that he then defies. I think there's some risk in ruling against him in the tariff case, in that there's a question about whether there would have to be the refund of billions of dollars that these plaintiffs have been on the hook for, and many, many others potentially as well. And I can imagine him saying no. Like, if he's directed to refund, to stop imposing the tariffs and to refund some of what's been paid. And I am sure that that will figure in their calculation about how to rule here.
Well, maybe they'll just give him not a complete loss, but they'll say not moving forward,
Yeah,
and not with those tariffs that have already been collected.
absolutely possible. Yeah.
Our time is drawing near, and I want to touch on something else that had my ears up with the silent war that's going on against Argentina. At what point does it become a war that he has to go to Congress to stop the bombing? And these very well may be drug boats. We don't have any. We have two survivors. I think we never questioned them. We turned them over. I think we should have questioned them. At what point are we at war?
Um, well, so in terms of the Venezuelan boats and
Yeah,
the
I'm
nationals
sorry.
that
Did
have
I say
been,
Argentina?
yeah,
Yeah, I meant
yeah,
Venezuela.
yeah,
I'm
yeah, yeah,
sorry.
yeah. No, I mean, he's talking a lot about Argentina, but of course,
Yes.
Milei is his buddy.
Yes,
So
this
in
is
there, so
funny.
Argentina, we're actually sending quite, it's a very different interaction in that we are really subsidizing their farmers.
And
Um,
excuse my sarcasm for a second. And we can't get SNAP benefits for poor people here in America. But I digress with my sarcasm. Go ahead.
No, it's a quite legitimate point. Yes, I mean, I think that in terms of both the targeting of boats on just the asserted basis that they are involved in drug trafficking without any kind of even effort to make an evidentiary showing or to seek congressional consent, there's an argument that the federal statute, the War Powers Act, required the stopping of these bombings in the first week of November, if they were ever legal, which is, of course, quite contested. There's maybe an argument that there's a window in which he could engage in these hostilities, but then had to cease under the statute, and that time has now passed. So, I mean, there are experts on international law and the law of war who are far greater than I am, but the people that I really trust on this topic seem quite convinced that this is categorically unlawful, these strikes, and that there may be a real escalation, in that the administration about a week ago was talking about actually striking military targets inside Venezuela, not just
Yes.
boats, not to diminish the importance of the strikes on the boats. But I think it's part of the reason this question about, could the president actually have the power to declare war, even though that's Congress's under the Constitution, actually mattered a lot in the oral argument. And I don't know that the administration actually recognizes those limits, and courts are going to have a difficult time enforcing those limits in the context of actual war and hostility. It's not a space that courts are comfortable really operating in. So I think that actual limitations on presidential power there have to come from Congress. And there has been, I think, some somewhat encouraging signaling that there are some Republican members who are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the degree of military, force that is being used without any kind of consultation, even with Congress. So my hope is that this is something that bestirs Congress to actually provide a meaningful response.
Kate, I have a big question.
Sure.
Where were you when I was in law school? I would have loved to have sat in con class with you. So if you see this guy in the back of your classroom, he looks like this. That's going to be me
I should have you in for a
monitoring.
guest No, don't come in, come guest lecture sometime. I would love that.
I could sit and listen to you and your podcast every day because I'm a junkie when it comes to this. I want to thank you for ending what's been a great season two, and I just want you to give us some hope that it's going to be good out here. That's how we're going to end season two, with just the dynamite constitutional scholar Kate Shaw. Kate, tell us why everything is going to be okay.
Well, I can't do that, but I can remind your listeners that whatever the path out of this is, lawyers are going to be critical players in it. And so I think that, people are fond of disparaging lawyers, suggesting there are too many of us. But actually, I think that lower courts, bar associations, state attorneys general, lawyers at either little firms or some of the big national organizations have been working day in, day out, tirelessly, righteously to try to hold this administration to account and to blunt some of the damage that it is doing. And I think they have had some enormous and hugely important successes. And we are still in a very dire and perilous place, but I think they are the reason that things are not worse. And the way out of where we are right now is not going to be just through litigation. Litigation will be an important part of it, but actually shoring up and defending norms, rule of law norms, and constitutional norms is going to be something that is going to require broad participation, not just by, but very much including members of the legal profession. So I hope that that's at least like galvanizing and energizing, even if it's not leaving us with, an unduly rosy picture of where we right now are.
You make me feel good. I can't thank you enough for being here. Promise me you'll come back at another point sometime.
I'd be happy to.
Okay. And like I said, I'll be the guy with the dark glasses hiding in the back of your class, going back to law school again, just to hear you lecture. Okay, Kate?
Sounds great. I'll look
All
forward to
right.
it.
All right. Take care. And that ends season two of the Rule of Law, the Academy Speaks. I'll talk to you guys soon. I'm Joe Tucker, president of the Academy. So long.